The manila envelope arrived at Barry Goldwater's Phoenix office on a scorching Arizona afternoon in late September 1963. No return address, no postmark that revealed its origin. Just his name typed on expensive government stationery and a single line beneath it. Senator, thought you should know what they're really doing. A friend in Washington. Inside, Goldwater found photocopies of documents that would shake his faith in American democracy to its core. FBI surveillance reports on his family, detailed financial investigations into his department store empire, transcripts of recorded phone conversations from his Senate office. And at the top of each page, a single bureaucratic notation that explained everything, per directive of Vice President Johnson, Priority 1. If you think modern politics is dirty, wait until you hear what LBJ was doing in 1963. Subscribe and hit the bell for more hidden political stories, and tell me in the comments, how far should politicians go to win? Let's uncover the truth about the Johnson files. Barry Goldwater set the documents down on his mahogany desk and stared out at the desert landscape that had shaped his character. Somewhere in Washington, the second most powerful man in America had declared war on him, and Goldwater hadn't even known the battle had begun. The realization hit him like a physical blow, not because he was naive about political warfare, but because the scale and sophistication of Johnson's operation exceeded anything he had imagined possible. The first document in the envelope was dated 3 months earlier, just 2 weeks after Goldwater's inflammatory speech at the Republican Governors Conference, where he had criticized the Kennedy administration's civil rights approach. The FBI report, marked "Confidential Eyes Only," detailed a comprehensive investigation into Goldwater's business dealings, family background, and personal associations stretching back 20 years. Subject maintains extensive business contacts throughout Arizona and Southwest region, the report noted in bureaucratic prose. Financial records indicate no irregularities, though further investigation recommended into Native American land dealings circa 1951 to 1955. Subject's wife maintains correspondence with several individuals of possible interest, including redacted and redacted. Recommend continued surveillance of personal residence and Senate office communications. Goldwater's hands trembled slightly as he read his own life reduced to clinical observations and potential vulnerabilities. Someone had been watching his family, photographing his friends, analyzing his every business decision for anything that might be used against him. The violation felt personal and profound, not just an attack on his political ambitions, but an assault on his fundamental privacy and dignity. The second document revealed the true scope of Johnson's operation. It was an internal memo from J. Edgar Hoover to LBJ, dated July 15, 1963, outlining what the FBI director called Operation Desert Storm, a comprehensive intelligence gathering effort targeting the likely 1,964 Republican presidential nominee. Mr. Vice President, Hoover's memo began with characteristic formality. Per our discussion of July 10th, Bureau has initiated comprehensive background investigation of Senator Barry Goldwater, R. Arizona. Initial phase includes financial records, business associations, family connections, and communication intercepts. Phase 2 will expand to include close associates, campaign contributors, and potential vulnerabilities for opposition research purposes. The memo continued with chilling efficiency. Preliminary findings suggest subject maintains clean personal record, but several areas merit deeper investigation. Business dealings with Native American tribes during territorial expansion may provide grounds for ethical questions. Family member correspondence indicates possible associations worth exploring. Recommend expansion of surveillance to include physical premises and electronic communications. What followed was a detailed breakdown of Goldwater's life that read like a foreign intelligence assessment of an enemy agent. His pilot's license and aircraft ownership, his photography hobby and darkroom equipment, his collection of Native American artifacts and the provenance of each piece, his wife's charitable activities and social connections, his children's college records and career plans. Nothing was too personal, too innocent, or too irrelevant for Johnson's investigators. Goldwater walked to his office window and gazed out at the Camelback Mountain, rising from the desert floor. He had climbed that mountain as a boy, learning lessons about perseverance and self-reliance that had guided him through life. Now he felt as exposed as a man standing on that peak while vultures circled overhead, searching for any sign of weakness or vulnerability. The third document in the envelope was perhaps the most disturbing, a transcript of a recorded phone conversation between Goldwater and his longtime friend and political advisor, Stephen Shadegg. The conversation had taken place in Goldwater's Senate office just 1 week earlier, during what both men had assumed was a private discussion about potential campaign strategy. Transcript: Goldwater office, September 18, 1963 to 3:47 p.m. Steve, I'm telling you, if Kennedy runs in 64, we'll need a completely different approach than anything we've tried before. Barry, the civil rights issue is going to define everything. You can't sidestep it. I'm not planning to sidestep it. I'm planning to address it head on, but on constitutional grounds, not emotional appeals. That's a dangerous strategy. Johnson's people are already painting you as hostile to Negro advancement. Johnson's people can paint me however they want. I'm not changing my principles to win an election. The transcript continued for 6 pages, capturing not just words, but the tone and inflection that revealed strategic thinking and personal concerns. Someone had placed sophisticated recording equipment in his Senate office, equipment that required physical access, technical expertise, and ongoing maintenance. The violation was complete and systematic. But what troubled Goldwater most was not the existence of the surveillance. It was the obvious pleasure that Johnson's people took in their work. Marginal notes throughout the documents revealed an operation that had moved beyond political opposition research into something approaching personal destruction. Comments like pursue angle with wife's charity connections and investigate aircraft maintenance records for irregularities suggested investigators who were actively seeking ways to create scandals rather than simply documenting existing vulnerabilities. The fourth document was a planning memo for what its authors called Phase 3 of Operation Desert Storm. Dated September 20th, just 3 days earlier, it outlined plans to expand surveillance to include Goldwater's closest political allies, his major campaign contributors, and his extended family members. The memo's clinical language could not disguise its fundamental purpose: the total political destruction of Barry Goldwater through whatever means necessary. Phase 3 objectives, the memo explained, include comprehensive mapping of subjects' political network, identification of potential defectors or sources within subjects' organization, and development of actionable intelligence for use during primary campaign season. Special attention should be paid to any associations that might suggest extreme political views, unusual business practices, or personal conduct inconsistent with public image. The memo continued with operational details that revealed the sophistication of Johnson's intelligence apparatus. Phone taps would be expanded to include Goldwater's Arizona business office and his family's personal residence. Mail intercepts would monitor correspondence with key Republican leaders and potential donors. Physical surveillance would document meetings, social events, and travel patterns that might reveal strategic plans or personal vulnerabilities. Most disturbing was the memo's final section, which outlined plans for strategic information deployment during the upcoming campaign season. Johnson's team was not merely gathering intelligence for defensive purposes. They were preparing to weaponize every detail of Goldwater's life for maximum political impact. The timing of revelations, the coordination with friendly media outlets, the development of narrative themes that would transform innocent activities into evidence of unfitness for office. It was all there, laid out with the precision of a military campaign. Goldwater set down the documents and walked to his office safe, where he kept his most sensitive correspondence and important papers. As he turned the combination dial, he wondered how many of Johnson's people knew the safe's contents, how many had studied the layout of his office, how many had walked through his private spaces and cataloged his personal belongings for future use against him. The final document in the envelope was perhaps the most revealing, not because of its content, but because of its source. It was a handwritten note from someone who signed himself only as Conscience, and it explained why these documents had found their way to Goldwater's office. "Senator," the note began in precise handwriting, "I am a career government employee who has served my country faithfully for 15 years. I believe in robust political competition, but what Vice President Johnson has ordered goes beyond anything I have seen in my professional experience. The American people deserve to choose their leaders based on honest debate about real issues, not on manufactured scandals created by government surveillance." The note continued, "I am providing you with these documents because I believe you have the right to know what is being done to you and your family. I am also providing them because I believe the American people have the right to know what their government is willing to do to influence elections. Whether you choose to expose this operation or use this knowledge for your own political advantage is your decision. I trust your judgment more than I trust those who authorize this surveillance." The anonymous author concluded with a warning: "Be aware that this operation is larger than what these documents reveal. Similar files exist on other potential Republican candidates, on conservative activists, and on anyone else that Vice President Johnson considers a potential threat to his political ambitions. What you hold in your hands is not an aberration. It is the systematic abuse of government power for partisan political purposes." Goldwater folded the handwritten note and locked it in his safe alongside the other documents. Then he sat back in his chair and considered the impossible choice that confronted him. He held in his hands evidence of the most comprehensive political surveillance operation in American history, evidence that could destroy Lyndon Johnson's political career and reshape the 1964 election. But using that evidence would require him to become the kind of politician he had spent his career opposing. The easy path was obvious. Leak the documents to friendly journalists, watch Johnson's vice presidency implode in scandal, and ride the resulting wave of public outrage to the Republican nomination and possibly the White House. The Johnson files would become a political weapon more powerful than any opposition research or campaign strategy. They would transform Goldwater from underdog to favorite virtually overnight. But the easy path violated everything Goldwater believed about honor, dignity, and the proper conduct of democratic politics. Using Johnson's surveillance against him would make Goldwater complicit in the very system he sought to reform. It would reduce him to Johnson's level and validate the assumption that all politicians were willing to sacrifice principle for advantage. As afternoon shadows lengthened across his office, Goldwater considered a third option, one that satisfied neither his political ambitions nor his desire for revenge, but that aligned with his deepest convictions about leadership and character. He could expose the surveillance operation without using it for personal political gain. He could make the Johnson files public, not to destroy his opponent, but to protect the democratic process from the kind of abuse that threatened its foundations. This option appealed to Goldwater's sense of justice, but it also carried enormous risks. Johnson would undoubtedly deny everything, claim the documents were fabricated, and launch a counterattack designed to destroy Goldwater's credibility. The media would demand proof that Goldwater could not provide without compromising his source. The Republican establishment would question his political judgment and wonder whether he was psychologically prepared for the ruthless realities of national politics. Worse still, exposing the surveillance operation might accomplish nothing except making Johnson more careful in the future. The vice president could simply shut down Operation Desert Storm, destroy the existing files, and develop more sophisticated methods of political intelligence gathering. Goldwater's gesture toward principle might result in reform that lasted only as long as Johnson needed to develop better ways of achieving the same objectives. That evening, Goldwater drove home to Paradise Valley, where his wife Peggy was waiting with dinner and questions about his obviously troubled mood. He told her nothing about the documents locked in his office safe, but she recognized the signs of a man wrestling with decisions that would define not just his political future, but his fundamental character. "Barry," she said over coffee, "whatever's troubling you, remember that we didn't come to Washington to become like everyone else. We came to be ourselves, regardless of the consequences." Her words struck him with unexpected force. Peggy understood him well enough to know that his struggles rarely involved political tactics or strategic calculations. When Barry Goldwater appeared deeply troubled, it usually meant he was confronting a situation where doing the right thing might require personal sacrifice. Later that night, Goldwater sat in his study with the anonymous note spread before him. Conscience had trusted him with information that could change American politics, but that trust came with implicit responsibility. The documents were not just evidence of Johnson's wrongdoing, they were a test of Goldwater's own character and his commitment to the principles he claimed to represent. The next morning brought new developments that complicated Goldwater's decision. His longtime aide called to report strange incidents at the Phoenix campaign office. Phones that produced odd background noises. File cabinets that appeared to have been searched. Unfamiliar vehicles parked across the street during evening hours. Operation Desert Storm was apparently continuing, which meant that every day Goldwater delayed, his response was another day that his privacy and that of his associates was being violated. That afternoon, Goldwater received a call from a prominent Republican donor who mentioned, almost casually, that federal tax auditors had recently appeared at his business with questions about his political contributions. The donor assumed it was routine, but Goldwater recognized it as evidence that Johnson's operation had expanded beyond surveillance into intimidation. The vice president was not content merely to gather intelligence about his potential opponents. He was actively working to disrupt their political operations. Similar reports arrived throughout the week. Campaign volunteers questioned by government officials about their political activities. Business leaders who had expressed interest in supporting Goldwater suddenly facing regulatory investigations. Conservative activists finding themselves subjects of seemingly random law enforcement attention. The pattern was unmistakable. Johnson was using the full power of the federal government to neutralize potential opposition before the 1964 campaign even began. Each new report strengthened Goldwater's resolve to act, but it also reinforced the dangers he faced. Johnson's operation was not the work of rogue agents or overzealous investigators. It was a systematic abuse of government power that reached into multiple agencies and departments. Challenging it would require more than moral courage. It would require political courage sufficient to confront the entire Democratic establishment. On Friday evening, October 4th, Goldwater made his decision. He would not use the Johnson files for personal political advantage, but he would not allow the surveillance operation to continue unchallenged. Instead, he would do something that went against every political instinct he possessed. He would warn Johnson directly about what he knew and give the vice president a chance to shut down Operation Desert Storm before it became public. Knowledge. The decision reflected Goldwater's fundamental belief that personal honor mattered more than political victory. He would not stoop to Johnson's level, but he would also not allow Johnson to continue violating the democratic process. By confronting the vice president directly, Goldwater would give him an opportunity to do the right thing while also making clear that continued surveillance would have consequences. Saturday morning, Goldwater placed a call to Johnson's office, requesting an urgent meeting on a matter of mutual interest that requires immediate attention. Johnson's secretary, surprised by the unusual request from a political opponent, nevertheless arranged for a private meeting that afternoon at the vice president's Capitol office. Johnson received Goldwater with characteristic political theater, warm handshakes, offers of bourbon, discussion of Texas weather and Arizona business conditions. But Goldwater's serious demeanor quickly made clear that this was not a social call or an attempt at political accommodation. "Lyndon," Goldwater said once they were seated in Johnson's private office, "I'm here because someone sent me some documents that I think you need to know about." Johnson's expression didn't change, but Goldwater noticed a slight stiffening in his posture that suggested immediate alertness. The vice president had spent decades in Washington learning to control his reactions, but he could not entirely hide his concern about documents serious enough to prompt an emergency meeting with a political opponent. "What kind of documents, Barry?" Johnson asked, his voice carefully neutral. Goldwater pulled out photocopies of 3 FBI reports and placed them on Johnson's desk. The kind that details surveillance operations targeting American senators and their families. The kind that suggests government agencies are being used for partisan political purposes. Johnson glanced at the documents without picking them up, his poker face revealing nothing about whether he recognized their contents or understood their implications. But Goldwater had spent enough time reading men in business negotiations to recognize the telltale signs of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. "Barry," Johnson said slowly, "I hope you're not suggesting that I would use government resources for political surveillance. That would be a very serious accusation." "I'm not making accusations, Lyndon. I'm sharing information that someone thought I should have. Information that suggests Operation Desert Storm is more than just a weather phenomenon." The code name hit Johnson like a physical blow. His careful composure cracked slightly, revealing the calculating political mind behind the folksy exterior. Only a handful of people knew the operation's code name, which meant that someone very close to the surveillance effort had chosen to betray his confidence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Johnson said, but his voice lacked the conviction of genuine ignorance. Goldwater leaned forward. "Lyndon, we both know what this is about. You're preparing for 1964, and you want to make sure you know everything possible about your likely opponents. I understand the impulse, but this goes too far." Johnson's response revealed the depth of his political cynicism. "Barry, if someone is conducting unauthorized surveillance, I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. But you can't seriously expect me to comment on documents that could have been fabricated by anyone." "These documents weren't fabricated," Goldwater replied. "They contain details about my family and business that could only come from systematic government surveillance. Details that no political opponent could obtain through normal opposition research." The two men stared at each other across Johnson's desk, each understanding that the conversation had moved beyond political gamesmanship into something approaching personal confrontation. Johnson was being forced to confront evidence of activities he could not acknowledge without destroying his political future. Goldwater was challenging not just a political operation, but the fundamental assumptions about how power should be used in a democracy. "What do you want, Barry?" Johnson finally asked. "I want it stopped. All of it. The surveillance, the investigations, the intimidation of contributors and volunteers. I want you to call off your dogs before this becomes public knowledge." Johnson's laugh was harsh and calculating. "And if I don't? Are you planning to go public with stolen documents and accusations you can't prove?" Goldwater's response surprised them both. "No, Lyndon, I'm not going to use this against you politically, but I'm also not going to pretend I don't know what you're doing. If this continues, if you keep using government power to spy on American citizens for political purposes, then I'll have to consider my options." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Johnson understood that Goldwater possessed information that could destroy his political career. But he also understood that Goldwater's principles might prevent him from using that information effectively. It was a classic standoff between political pragmatism and personal honor. "Barry," Johnson said after a long pause, "you're a good man, but you're naive about how politics really works in this town. Information is power, and power is what determines who gets to shape America's future. You can play by gentlemen's rules if you want, but don't expect your opponents to handicap themselves for your moral comfort." Goldwater stood up, his decision crystallizing in that moment. "Lyndon, that's exactly the attitude that's destroying faith in government. When politicians start believing that winning justifies any means, democracy becomes just another word for organized corruption." As Goldwater walked toward the door, Johnson made one final attempt at political calculation. "Barry, you realize that exposing this surveillance would hurt the Democratic Party just months after Dallas? The country needs stability, not another political crisis." Goldwater turned back, his voice carrying the moral authority that had made him a conservative icon. "The country needs leaders who respect the Constitution more than they fear political consequences. If you can't understand that difference, then maybe it's time for new leadership. The meeting ended without resolution, but both men understood that the political landscape had shifted. Johnson knew that his surveillance operation was compromised and that Goldwater possessed information that could surface at any time. Goldwater knew that he had chosen principle over political advantage, but that his choice might accomplish nothing except making him a target for more sophisticated attacks. Over the following weeks, Goldwater noticed gradual changes that suggested Johnson had indeed scaled back Operation Desert Storm. The unusual phone activity at his offices decreased. Reports of government harassment of his supporters became less frequent. The obvious surveillance activities that had troubled his staff seemed to diminish. Johnson had apparently decided that the risks of continued surveillance outweighed its potential benefits. But Goldwater also understood that his confrontation with Johnson had probably accomplished only a temporary tactical retreat rather than fundamental reform. The vice president had not abandoned his commitment to using every available tool for political advantage. He had simply recognized that his current approach had become too risky to continue. As the 1964 campaign season approached, Goldwater carried with him the knowledge of what his opposition was willing to do and the satisfaction of having chosen honor over advantage when faced with impossible choices. The Johnson files remained locked in his safe, evidence of political corruption that he could not bring himself to use for personal gain. Years later, after Johnson had won the presidency and expanded American involvement in Vietnam, after Watergate had revealed the full scope of presidential surveillance abuses, after the Church Committee had documented decades of government spying on American citizens, Barry Goldwater would remember his confrontation with Lyndon Johnson as a moment when American democracy had teetered on the edge of something terrible. He had possessed the power to expose that abuse and had chosen not to use it for personal advantage. Whether that choice represented principled leadership or political naivety would be debated by historians and political scientists for decades. But for Goldwater himself, the choice had been simple. He would not become the thing he opposed, even if that decision cost him the presidency. The Johnson files remained his secret, a reminder of the prices that honor demanded and the choices that defined not just political careers, but national character. In a city that measured success by victory and influence, Barry Goldwater had chosen a different metric, the ability to sleep peacefully with the knowledge that power had not corrupted the principles that brought him to Washington. The manila envelope that had arrived on that scorching Arizona afternoon had contained more than evidence of political surveillance. It had contained a test of character that revealed the fundamental difference between politicians who sought power to serve their principles and those who abandoned their principles to serve their power. In the end, that difference would define both Barry Goldwater's political legacy and his personal peace of mind.